Hello and welcome. This is the Papyrus Global TV, and here is the world news. Before we begin, the headlines. G20 summit in South Africa sets ambitious global action on climate and inequality. Pope Leo XIV pleads for release of kidnapped students and priests in Nigeria and Cameroon. Israel and Hamas trade blame over recent ceasefire violation. Guinea-Bissau votes as president runs for a second term. China pledges closer cooperation with South Africa on multiple fronts. G20 leaders adopt declaration at Africa Summit despite US objections. Niger's General Tchiani returns to Niamey after a massive welcome tour. And now in Johannesburg, leaders adopted a landmark declaration that emphasizes aggressive climate action and greater economic equity for poorer nations. Despite deep global divides, the participating countries committed to scaling up renewable energy investments, expanding access to climate finance, and strengthening support for developing economies. The declaration calls for a just transition, ensuring developing countries benefit from the green energy shift instead of being left behind by promoting technology transfer, clean energy infrastructure, and structured concessional financing. Emerging economies, long critical of their exclusion from climate decision-making, welcomed the commitment as a step toward rectifying global imbalance. Several leaders also highlighted that inequality is as serious a crisis as climate change. According to summit communiques, richer nations must not only decarbonize but also channel investments into vulnerable economies, particularly in Africa. The 14th has made a heartfelt appeal for immediate release of hundreds of students and clergy abducted in Nigeria and Cameroon. Speaking from St. Peter's Square, the pontiff expressed immense sadness over the kidnappings and urged competent authorities to take appropriate and timely decisions to secure their liberation. In Nigeria, around 315 students and teachers were reportedly taken from St. Mary's High School in Niger State. In Cameroon, 6 Catholic priests from the Archdiocese of Bamenda were kidnapped along with a Baptist pastor. The Pope also called for a renewed spirit of prayer and solidarity, asking the faithful to pray that churches and schools remain places of safety and hope. Let us pray that churches and schools may always and everywhere remain safe spaces for hope, he said. Escalating again between Israel and Hamas after both sides accused each other of breaking a recent ceasefire. According to Africa News, rocket fire resumed in Gaza while Israeli forces reported a surge in militant activity, prompting renewed international concern over the fragility of the truce. Hamas said that violations were provoked by Israeli incursions and alleged provocations near Gaza's borders. In contrast, Israeli officials argue that Hamas used the lull to regroup and rearm, claiming recent rock launches originated from within the enclave. Diplomatic actors, including regional powers, have called for a de-escalation and a return to negotiations, warning that any collapse could trigger a broader humanitarian crisis. In national elections as President Umaru Sissoco Embalo seeks re-election. The vote comes amid ongoing economic challenges, security concerns, and debates over foreign influence in the country's political direction. Embalo, first elected in 2020, is campaigning heavily on promises of greater stability, economic reform, and improved public infrastructure. His opponents argue that his administration has not sufficiently addressed poverty or corruption. Voter turnout will be closely watched as next week's result could shape both the country's domestic trajectory and its external partnerships, especially with regional powers and international investors.
We will now go on a short break, and when we come back, the news will continue. Stay tuned.
The Papyrus Global, we don't just cover events, we create cinematic experiences. From red carpets to birthdays, gala dinners, and your fairy tale weddings, we bring your moments to life with high-tech precision. Our gadgets are smarter, our lenses sharper, and our team simply world-class. Trust the Papyrus Global to tell your story in the boldest, brightest way possible.
Welcome back, and now the news will continue.
China has reaffirmed its commitment to strengthening strategic cooperation with South Africa using the platform of the G20 summit in Johannesburg to outline an expanded partnership spanning trade, infrastructure, technology, and clean energy financing. Chinese officials announced plans uh, to extend concessional financing for South Africa's renewable energy sector, specifically targeting solar, wind, and grid stabilization initiatives. This move, they said, is designed to address South Africa's long-standing power deficits while positioning the country as a continental hub for clean energy technology. Beyond energy, both nations are preparing to deepen collaboration on advanced research and development, including next-generation technologies such as artificial intelligence, smart manufacturing, and digital public infrastructure. Beijing also signaled interest in increasing bilateral trade flows for easing market access for South African goods and expanding Chinese investments in industrial zones and special economic corridors. South African officials welcomed the pledge, noting that China's support could significantly strengthen the country's economic resilience, stimulate job creations, and reinforce its leadership role within African and BRICS economic blocs. World leaders at the 2025 G Summit in Johannesburg adopted a sweeping declaration focused on climate action, global inequality, and fairer international financing, an outcome largely driven by an unusually unified African bloc pressing for systemic reforms on behalf of developing nations. The summit, hosted by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, opened with an unexpected breakthrough: adoption of the Leaders' Declaration at the beginning of the summit rather than its conclusion, an unprecedented move that signaled urgency and rare diplomatic alignment despite U.S. hesitation on climate commitments. President Ramaphosa, whose leadership shaped the negotiation process, was joined by several prominent African heads of state who used the global platform to amplify Africa's demands. Those present included Mozambique's President Daniel Chapo, Namibia's President Netumbo Ndaitwah, and Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, all of whom underscored the need for fairer financial systems, accelerated climate finance, and deeper partnerships with the Global South. Collectively, the African leaders pushed for reforms within multilateral lending institutions, a greater African voice in global decision-making, and binding commitments from industrialized nations on emission cuts. They argue that without sustained financing for adaptation, Africa, already facing droughts, flooding, and food insecurity, remains dangerously exposed. The adopted declaration commits G20 nations to strengthen climate adaptation funding, gradual restructuring of unsustainable debts in vulnerable economies, and expanded development partnerships. It also calls for global taxation tools, including measures on digital economies, to ensure fairer revenue distribution for developing countries. Though the United States maintained reservations on certain climate-related financial clauses, the broader coalition of nations, including Africa, Asia, and South America, pushed the declaration through with overwhelming support. The summit continues with negotiations on energy transitions, technology access, global taxation, and the mining value chain areas where African leaders are seeking firm, time-bound commitments. South Africa is expected to present additional frameworks on green industrialization before the summit concludes. General Abdulrahman Chiani, the head of Niger's ruling military council, has returned to Niamey after completing a nationwide tour. He was met by thousands of supporters along the route, signaling continued popular backing for his leadership despite concerns over governance. During his trip, Chayani called for national unity and urged both civilian population and military forces to remain vigilant against terrorism. He used the tour to portray himself as a unifying figure who understands the security challenges Niger faces, especially in remote and underserved areas. Supporters say the tour was an attempt to reaffirm his mandate following the 2023 coup that installed him in power. Critics, however, warn that while public displays of loyalty are strong, structural reforms and democratic transitions remain fragile. And that brings us to the end of World News on Papyrus Global TV. My name is Christiana Babayo. Thanks for joining us.